The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning hum when the recording started playing. She's already suspicious. Tara. Then we moved faster. The doctor said 6 to 8 weeks with the right dosage. We don't have to wait for him to die naturally, Mitchell. We just have to help it along. Nobody moved. The judge didn't move. The jury didn't move. My son sat at the defense table with his hands folded in front of him, staring at the surface of the wood like he was trying to find something in the grain. His wife sat beside him, spine straight, face arranged into an expression I can only describe as controlled emptiness. She'd been practicing that face for months. I'd watched her practice it. I was 74 years old, sitting in the third row of a federal courtroom in Denver, Colorado, listening to my son and daughter-in-law discuss the most efficient way to kill me. Let me back up. My name is not important to this story, but my career is. I spent 31 years as a cardiothoracic surgeon at St. Luke's Medical Center. I've held a human heart in my hands. I know what it takes to keep one beating, and I know, better than most, exactly what it takes to make one stop. My son knew that too. He'd grown up watching me leave before sunrise and come home after dark, knew the weight that career carried, knew what I'd sacrificed for it. He'd told people his whole life that his father was a heart surgeon, told it like it meant something. His name is Mitchell. He's 43 years old. He has my eyes and his mother's stubbornness, and somewhere along the way he developed a third quality that belonged to neither of us: greed. His wife's name is Tara. She came into his life 11 years ago, arrived at a Christmas dinner with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, and I made the mistake, the first of several, of writing that observation off as shyness. My wife, Lorraine, died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end. Fast and brutal, the way that particular disease tends to go. After she passed, the house felt like a museum. 4,000 square feet in Cherry Hills Village. The kind of neighborhood where people mow their lawns on Saturday mornings and wave at each other from driveways. We'd bought it in 1987 for a price that sounds laughable now. By the time Lorraine died, the Zillow estimate was pushing $2.4 million. Mitchell knew the number. He'd looked it up. I know because Tara mentioned it once at dinner, casually, the way you mention something you've been thinking about for a long time and finally decided doesn't need to be hidden anymore. Dad, do you ever think about downsizing? A place like this with the market the way it is? She'd trailed off. I'd changed the subject, but I remembered. After Lorraine died, Mitchell suggested I let them move in, help around the house, keep me company, make sure I wasn't alone. I said yes. I want to be honest about that. I said yes because I was lonely and because he was my son, and because I told myself the unease I felt about Tara was grief-talking, was my own bitterness, finding a target it didn't deserve. That was 18 months before the courtroom. The first 6 months were fine. Then small things started. My prescription medications were moved. Reorganized, Tara said. Then I started feeling tired in ways I couldn't explain, a heaviness that sat behind my eyes, a fogginess that didn't lift until mid-afternoon. I'm 74. I told myself that was just age. I told myself that for longer than I should have. What changed my mind was a Saturday in March, when I came downstairs at 2 in the morning because I couldn't sleep, and I found Tara in the kitchen, not eating or drinking, just standing at the counter, with her phone face down, and my prescription pill bottles arranged in front of her. She looked up when I came in and her face did something. A half second of something I can only describe as caught, before the controlled emptiness clicked back into place. Couldn't sleep either, she said. I was getting water and noticed these were in the wrong cabinet. I nodded, said something bland, went back upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a long time. I had 31 years of reading situations quickly. In surgery, you don't get the luxury of deliberation. You assess, decide, you act. And sitting there at 2 in the morning, I assessed what I knew. Lorraine was gone. The house was worth $2.4 million. My son was 43 and had a history of financial problems I'd quietly helped him out of 3 times, totaling just under $90,000, and my daughter-in-law had been standing in my kitchen at 2 a.m. with my medications laid out in front of her. I didn't confront them. That would have been the wrong move. Instead, I called my attorney, a woman named Sandra Okafor, who'd handled my estate planning since the 90s and who had the particular quality I've always admired in good professionals. She listened more than she talked. I told her what I'd observed. She listened. Then she said, very quietly, I think we should talk about some additional precautions. The next week, I had a full toxicology panel done at a private lab in Aurora. Told my GP I wanted a comprehensive workup. Nothing unusual about that for a man my age. The results came back 5 days later. Traces of diphenhydramine, antihistamine, at levels inconsistent with anything I'd taken myself. Consistent with someone adding it to food or drink over a period of weeks. Enough to cause fatigue, cognitive fog, the kind of symptoms that in a 74-year-old man would be attributed to age without a second thought. I sat with that information for 48 hours before I decided what to do with it. Sandra connected me with a private investigator, a former DEA agent named Chester Pruitt, who had the energy of a man half his age and the patience of someone who'd spent decades waiting for people to make mistakes. I told him what I needed. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. I also called my estate attorney and asked him to draw up a new will. I won't go into every detail, but the short version is this. I removed Mitchell from my estate entirely. The house, my retirement accounts, my investment portfolio, none of it would go to him. I arranged for the bulk of my estate to be divided between St. Luke's Cardiac Research Fund and a nonprofit that provides legal assistance to elderly victims of financial abuse. I asked the notary, a man named Philip Garza, who'd worked with my attorney's office for 20 years, to keep the document confidential until my death or until I authorized its release. Mitchell didn't know any of this. He thought the will was the one from 2019, the one that left him everything. Chester installed cameras in the house, small ones, positioned in common areas, nothing in bedrooms or bathrooms. He also helped me document the medication situation, working with a pharmacist friend of mine to create a paper trail that would hold up under scrutiny. What I did not plan was what happened on a Tuesday evening in November. Mitchell came home from work at 6:30, which was unusual. He typically worked late. Tara was already home. I was reading in the study. I heard them talking in the kitchen, low voices with an urgency to them, and something made me stop and listen. Chester had given me a small audio device. I'd been carrying it for weeks without having cause to use it. I turned it on. The accountant called again, Mitchell said. What did you tell him? What do you think I told him? I told him we're working on it. A pause. We're running out of time, Tara. The payment's due in February, $240,000. Then we need to move faster. How? He's not declining fast enough. The doctor would notice a sudden change. And that was when Tara said it. The sentence that would play in that courtroom 6 months later. The doctor said 6 to 8 weeks with the right dosage. We don't have to wait for him to die naturally, Mitchell. We just have to help it along. I stood in the hallway outside the study, and I did not move for a very long time. Then I went back to my chair, and I kept reading my book, because the only way to do what came next was to keep moving forward as if nothing had changed. I called Chester that night. He told me to stay calm, stay in the house, continue acting normally. He contacted the Denver Police Department and was referred to their Elder Abuse Division. What followed was a coordination that I wasn't fully aware of until later. Law enforcement monitoring. A controlled situation where Chester's documentation and documents and my own recordings would be legally admissible. A careful construction of a case. that couldn't be unwound by a clever defense attorney. 3 weeks later, I told Mitchell and Tara that I was going to see a specialist in Colorado Springs for a routine follow-up, that I'd be back by dinner. I left the house at 9 in the morning. I drove to Sandra's office instead, and I sat in her conference room and I waited. At 2:17 in the afternoon, Mitchell and Tara met with a man who had contacted them 6 weeks earlier through a back channel Chester had constructed. He presented himself as a specialist in estate document revision, a forger, in plain language, and had offered to alter my existing will in exchange for a payment contingent on the estate transfer. What Mitchell and Tara did not know was that this man was working with law enforcement. What they signed that afternoon in a coffee shop in Greenwood Village was not a contract with a forger. It was their confession. The arrest happened the following morning. I was not there. Chester had advised me against it, and he was right. I sat at Sandra's kitchen table. She'd offered to have me over, hadn't wanted me to be alone. And I drank coffee and watched the sun move across her backyard while my son and daughter-in-law were handcuffed in the home I'd owned for 37 years. The trial was 8 months later. I won't pretend those 8 months were easy. There were days when the grief was indistinguishable from the anger, when I couldn't tell if what I felt was the loss of my son or the loss of the person I'd believed my son to be. Those are different things. I want to be clear about that. The man in that courtroom, the one who'd stood in my kitchen and talked about helping my death along, he was not the boy I'd raised. I don't know when the switch happened. I don't know if Tara was the cause or the accelerant, or if the capacity for this had always been in him, dormant, waiting for the right circumstances to surface. I'll be honest, I don't know that it matters. The prosecution was handled by an assistant DA named Marcus Webb, a methodical man in his late 40s who reminded me of my best residents. The ones who never got flustered, who could be handed an impossible situation and simply begin working through it. The defense attorney was a woman named Joanna Slater, who was talented and aggressive, and who clearly understood that her clients were guilty and was playing to mitigate rather than acquit. She tried. I'll give her that. She argued that the recordings were taken under duress, that I'd been suffering from grief-induced paranoia following my wife's death, that the toxicology results were consistent with over-the-counter sleep aids I might have taken myself and forgotten about. She brought in a geriatric psychologist who testified about cognitive decline in elderly men following spousal loss, suggested that my memories and perceptions from that period might not be reliable. Marcus dismantled each argument with the patience of a man who'd been doing this for 20 years. The toxicology panel was conducted at a certified independent laboratory, he said during his closing. The chain of custody is documented and unbroken. The recordings were made in the defendant's own home by the homeowner himself, and the conversation captured on those recordings leaves no room for alternative interpretation. These were not the words of a devoted family managing a difficult situation. These were the words of people planning to end a man's life for financial gain. Joanna had one more card to play. She called me to the stand. I'd been expecting it. Marcus had prepared me for 3 hours the week before. He told me to answer only what was asked, to stay calm, and to remember that the jury would be watching, not just what I said, but how I said it. Joanna started gently. She asked about Lorraine, about how I'd been coping with the loss, about whether I'd experienced depression. I answered honestly. Then she pivoted. Mister, she caught herself, used my name. You're a cardiothoracic surgeon. You understand medications, drug interactions, dosages. Bach, I do. You would know, for example, how much diphenhydramine would cause the symptoms you described. I would. And you could have taken those amounts yourself. I could have. I didn't. But you can't rule it out. I had a private toxicology panel done specifically because I noticed symptoms I couldn't explain. I didn't take diphenhydramine in any form during the period in question. The results reflect what was in my system. I didn't put it there. She shifted. You installed cameras in your home without informing your son, who was living there. It's my home. I'm legally entitled to install cameras in common areas. But you didn't tell him. If I had told him, the cameras would have served no purpose. So you were surveilling your own family. I looked at her steadily. I was documenting what was happening in my own home. After I found my medications arranged on my kitchen counter at 2 in the morning and began experiencing unexplained symptoms that a toxicology panel later confirmed were caused by substances I hadn't taken, I documented my home. What I documented is what this jury has seen. She tried one more angle. Isn't it possible that your son and daughter-in-law were under extraordinary financial pressure, were frightened, and said things they didn't mean? I took a breath. When I was in surgery, there were moments when the situation became critical, when the pressure was at its highest. People reveal themselves under pressure, not who they wish they were, who they are. My son and daughter-in-law, under pressure, discussed increasing the dosage of a substance they'd been adding to my food or drink in order to accelerate my death. That's not a figure of speech. That's not an expression of frustration. That's a plan. Joanna sat down. The jury deliberated for 2 days. I spent those 2 days at a hotel near the courthouse rather than the house, which still felt inhabited by ghosts I wasn't ready to face. I read. I slept badly. I called my sister in Phoenix twice and didn't tell her how frightened I was because she had her own health problems and I didn't want to add to them. I ate room service meals I barely tasted and watched the news with the volume low and waited. On the afternoon of the second day, my phone rang. Marcus, verdict's in. The courtroom filled quickly. I took my seat and I watched Mitchell and Tara be led in. Mitchell looked like he'd lost 15 pounds. Tara's controlled emptiness had finally cracked. There was something raw underneath it now, something that might have been fear. The foreperson was a man in his 60s, a retired high school principal from Aurora. He held the paper with both hands. The judge spoke on the charge of attempted murder in the first degree against Mitchell. Guilty. Mitchell closed his eyes. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud. Guilty. On the charge of elder financial abuse. Guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit forgery. Guilty. 4 charges. 4 guilty verdicts. Then Tara's charges, the same result. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom stirred, that particular sound of a large group of people exhaling at the same time. I sat quietly. I didn't feel what I'd expected to feel. I'd expected relief, or satisfaction, or something clean and definitive. Instead, what I felt was a heaviness that had nothing to do with what had just been confirmed and everything to do with what it meant. My son was going to prison. Whatever he had become, he had been, once, a boy who'd fallen asleep in the back seat, on long drives, and who'd cried when our dog died, and who'd called me from his college dorm room at 11 o'clock at night because he was struggling in organic chemistry and didn't know who else to call. That boy was not separate from the man in the orange jumpsuit. They were the same person. That was the thing I couldn't reconcile, and I've stopped trying. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. Joanna made her arguments. Mitchell's financial desperation, Tara's influence, the absence of a prior criminal record. Marcus countered with the premeditation, the duration, the deliberate targeting of a vulnerable elderly man by the people he trusted most. The judge, a woman named the Honorable Patricia Delgado, who had a reputation for sentences that matched the severity of the crime, looked at Mitchell for a long moment before she spoke. Mr. Mitchell. She used his last name. You did not make a mistake under pressure. You made a plan. You executed that plan over a period of months. You invited your father's trust and then used it as a weapon against him. This court takes that seriously. Mitchell received 16 years in the Colorado Department of Corrections. Tara received 14. The disparity came down to what the investigation had revealed. Tara had initiated the contact with the supposed forger, had been the primary strategist in the financial fraud scheme, and had been the one to suggest increasing the medication dosage. Mitchell had followed. That didn't excuse him, but the law distinguishes between the architect and the contractor, and the sentences reflected that. Some people in the gallery were unhappy with the gap. I understood why. Honestly, I had a moment where I understood why. But Marcus explained it to me afterward, and I accepted it. They were also ordered to pay restitution. $412,000, representing the total amount of financial manipulation traced to the scheme, along with legal costs and damages, their joint assets, 2 leased cars, jewelry, furniture, a joint savings account with $14,000 in it, were seized. It covered almost nothing. The debt would follow them for the rest of their lives. After the sentencing, as they were preparing to lead Mitchell out, I walked to the railing. I'd thought about what I wanted to say. I'd gone back and forth on whether to say anything at all. In the end, I said only this. I kept every card you ever made me. Birthday cards, Father's Day cards, the ones you drew yourself when you were little. I have them in a box in storage. I didn't throw them away. I don't know what that means. I just thought you should know. He looked at me. He didn't say anything. His eyes were wet. I nodded once and walked back to my seat. Outside the courthouse, Chester was waiting. He shook my hand the way men of a certain generation shake hands when they mean something by it. "It's done," he said. "It's done," I agreed. The house sold 10 weeks after the trial to a family relocating from Chicago. 2 parents, 3 kids, a yellow Labrador that bounded across the front yard during the walkthrough like it already owned the place. I signed the papers in Sandra's office. She'd offered to have the closing catered. I told her that was excessive. She did it anyway. The house sold for $2.6 million. After taxes, legal fees, and the cost of the past year, I had just under $2 million to distribute. I gave $500,000 to the St. Luke's Cardiac Research Institute. I'd named a procedure during my career. Now I'd fund the next generation of people who might name their own. Another $500,000 went to ElderShield Colorado, the organization that had assisted with my case and that helps elderly men and women navigate exactly the kind of financial and legal predation I'd experienced. The remainder, after setting aside a reasonable amount for my own living expenses for however many years I have left, went into a trust that will fund medical school scholarships for students who demonstrate both academic excellence and financial need. The kind of students who would have been me 50 years ago if the circumstances hadn't broken right. Mitchell would have known those numbers, would have known what he lost. I moved to a condominium in Fort Collins, smaller than the house by a factor of 6, which is to say it's exactly the right size for one person. I have a view of the Cache la Poudre River from my kitchen window and a walking path nearby that I use every morning, earlier than I need to, because old habits don't retire. I still consult occasionally, teach 2 lectures a semester at the medical school, stay current enough to feel useful. I've started writing, not the book I mentioned to Chester, not yet, but notes. Observations about the intersection of aging and vulnerability, about the particular kind of trust that exists between a parent and a child, and what it costs when that trust is weaponized. I don't know if it'll become anything, but it helps to put it somewhere outside my own head. There's a cardiologist I know at the university, a woman who trained under one of my former residents, who asked me once, over coffee, whether I regretted what I did, the trap, the documentation, the long months of playing a role. I told her the truth. I regret that it was necessary. I do not regret that I was prepared. She nodded, like she understood, and maybe she did. She's been a doctor long enough to know the difference between what should be true and what is. The chess set I've had since 1979 sits on my coffee table. I play against myself sometimes, both sides, which sounds like a strange hobby, but is actually instructive. It forces you to think from a perspective that isn't naturally yours, to see the board the way your opponent sees it. I learned that skill early. It served me in the operating room for 3 decades. It served me in the year I spent preparing to survive my own son. I am 74 years old. I have outlived my wife, my career, and the version of my son I loved. What I have not outlived is my own judgment, and on the days when the grief comes back, because it does come back, I won't tell you otherwise. That's the thing I hold on to. I knew what was happening. I paid attention. I made sure it didn't work. That's not nothing. For a man my age, sitting alone in a quiet apartment with a river view and a chess set, and more years behind him than ahead, that's not nothing at all.